Welcome everyone to the Cluster Addons meeting. Today we have a very short agenda. It's one action from last time. Just do you want to talk about where you got?
Yes, I haven't yet tried merging in or using it with cups, but what I have really been working on is getting the support into Kube Builder. This is sort of the pattern thing. I think I managed to attend their monthly meeting last time, and we talked about that they want plugins, and so I am building it as a plugin and trying not to rewrite everything, but hopefully that will, I think the tests are green, so, and I think we have basic, like, this looks okay from Solly, so I am optimistic that by our next meeting we may have it. It will be feature flagged in some way, or in some way hidden in Kube Builder, but it should be in the main binary and will later move to a plugin type model.
Would we then also update our add-on example, the coordinates operator, to use this? And then we I could finish the docs or write some parts of the docs. I think that would make it much easier to explain.
Exactly. It's like, I know it's not like core, but it is definitely like, it is sort of holding up the train a little bit.
Super. I'm glad you're making progress there.
I just kind of mildly related to those things is I chatted with Sully as well about generating component config and how that would look in Kube Builder and whether that's a use case we would want to support there. The actual scaffolding of the API types and not just all the autogen stuff. And then as far as like actually what we can do once we have an example operator, I began looking at the node local DNS add-on and the kinds of requirements that they have. It's not looking too intimidating, but there's some interesting stuff in there. And it only works in HA mode with IP tables. So it's kind of some interesting trade-offs.
What do you mean it only works in HA mode with IP tables?
The HA mode requires an intercept rule in the IP tables to divert the UDP traffic from a service IP that's registered for the local stuff back to the kube DNS IP.
This is I guess a newer configuration I'm not aware of for HA node local DNS, not HA Kubernetes. Is that right?
Yes, for HA node local DNS. So trouble being, right, like when you're joining the node, that pod's going to get preempted at some point. All of your DNS traffic is going to a black hole. So how do you get it to send somewhere else? And currently it's just been some interesting hacks. And the trouble with that as well, right, is you're going to have DNS downtime anytime you try to update the daemon set. So how do you prevent that from happening? The other solution was to like actually have multiple daemon sets and then to like update them in an AD fashion. It's not very Kubernetes-esque, but that's a solution.
It's not Kubernetes.
It's just not very typical, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I think though we have not done it, our usage of daemon sets to date is a little happy-go-lucky. Like the way we update kubeproxy, for example. Like kubeproxy can no longer be a single daemon set if you imagine that different kubeproxy versions will exist. That's one of the things that I want to work on as part of an operator, because that's the sort of thing which just like is impractical to implement unless you actually have an operator where we could then have this is the daemon set pattern or whatever it is. So again, it's impractical like in general, but it can be practical if you wrap it in an operator that understands how to safely update daemon sets.
Yeah, I mean, it might be a more generic thing to have a rolling daemon set. A rolling update implemented for a daemon set. something along those lines. But yeah, in general, like these problems are just kind of thorny, but it's a perfect place to try out an add-on operator, and so that's kind of a cool thing to look forward to. So,
where are you working on that? Node local DNS was actually one of the ones I was going to look at for COP, so I was wondering if I could just use your operator or operator in progress.
No, I was just messing with the customized base for that. So the first part is like getting all of the like hard-coded strings that you're supposed to sed to actually be like something else. Another thing that I found out in that research, by the way, that's just core DNS in general, is core files actually support interpolating from environment variables. So we should use that. Their config syntax is from the Caddy server project. So, and yeah, if you read the Caddy server docs, there's quite a lot available in there. So instead of, templating the core file, we should make the core file an environment variable template, and then just provide differences. You could do an env from a config map or anything. So. Yeah. I guess you'll probably just take a look at the installer, some of the patterns we're using for the installer for COPS at some other point. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'm definitely gonna look at the kubeadm doc, and like hopefully we have a lot of overlap there. Like that's the you mean the installer for operators themselves, or you mean?
Yeah, I'm meaning the add-on installer is in like how do you get things into the cluster, right?
Yes. Where is that you're working on?
So that's the POC lib was pull 25 on the add-on operators repo. Yeah. No, don't worry about it. I know you're working on a bunch of other stuff, but I'm just trying to get a litmus because Fabricio and Lubomir and the rest of the Kubernetes team have been working really hard on like trying to figure out where should we go with this, and I just want to make sure that any concerns that you might have are also being heard.
Cool, thank you.
Yeah. Sweet.
One thing, by the way, that I was just looking at pull 25, and the first line says exec in kubectl, and I saw that was also in kubeadm, like the problems of that. Sean at Google has split out kubectl into staging. Obviously, it's like the newest Kubernetes, so I don't know whether we can use it in a backwards compatible way. And obviously, server-side apply is coming, but this may be a bridge between server-side apply, it's client-side apply with an embedded kubectl type thing. So
that would be particularly interesting. It's almost like a cooler client Go in a way.
Yes, it is additional client Go
function off of the open API docs in the API server you're talking to. Yeah.
What I don't know is whether there will be server-side apply influencing client-side, but I guess we'll find out.
Do we, well, and then there's the alpha feature for server dry run as well. So there's just so many dimensions to using kubectl. The only thing I have about this is like, it's great that you can vendor it, and you also just kind of get all of the same cons. I mean, kubectl master is probably pretty stable, but it's just you are, now accepting that dependency.
Yeah, the challenge seems to be that kubectl is not good at like cross Kubernetes dependencies. So kubectl, I don't know if it's still the case, but like kubectl 1.12 wouldn't work with Kubernetes 1.9, and like all these sort of, I think technically it wouldn't even work with Kubernetes 1.10 on some particular API types that had changed. Or like, table formatting, I think is now required, and so might be removed from kubectl, that sort of thing. And it is not like kubectl is very dependent on the Kubernetes version in a way that client Go is less dependent.
There is some other behavior that you would want, like from an actual library, that's just kind of not available in kubectl as well. Like when you do an apply and it tells you like that this is being changed, but it's a dry run, like those are two pieces of really juicy information that are not available when you ask for it to be printed out in like JSON. Right.
Yes. Related, so, we are tangenting, but related, I split out the drain functionality out of kubectl, so it could be used as a library. And yes, there are still bits where you like information that is important is printed to a stream, and you can redirect the stream, but it would be better to have some form of structured output, and we have to figure that out. But I think the first step could be to, as long as you don't actually need that information, it's just nice to have. The first step could be to split it into a library, and then we can like say, now what are the bits that I need? Maybe.
Yeah, I mean, it's basically, so we had the conversation in the POC, and one of Fabrizio's main questions was, okay, well, like what's controlling the output and how can Kubernetes influence the UX? And I was like, well, like you can pass in your IO writer, into the runtime, and then like from there, kubectl, the process that's running that, is going to be doing whatever it wants. And but here's what the UX would look like if you're just letting kubectl own that, right? With all of these other kind of options from the library, and like, does this feel acceptable for at least an alpha feature? And my thought is yes, right? But maybe not. It's certainly hard to build anything specific or like very tailored around add-on packages that could contain just about anything, right? Like it could be RBAC in there, or CRDs, or any number of interesting objects. You're not going to be able to write a lot of tool-specific logic around that. So,
what is an example of tool-specific logic you would like to build?
So there's some interesting comments in the doc. Maybe this is a good time for Fabrizio to start chatting a little more. Maybe about the pre-flight checks, or also some feedback that we've had from some Weaveworks people is like update, install, and uninstall hooks. So like writing like some place to run arbitrary code and then get results back in an agnostic way. So one pre-flight check that I can think of that's kind of, we've been talking about component config and about how the components that actually are owning the config APIs, that they should have a standard command line interface that you can exec. It returns a structured response about whether or not the config is validated, what errors are contained within, and then also be able to do things like conversions and defaulting. And so like that's an exec to another tool that's owning its specific version of the API, and it's to prevent the impossible matrix of imports you would need to support in order to do component config. And then normally the tool that you're working with, like it might have a specific number of add-ons that it's focused on, right? So Kubernetes is concerned with the kubeproxy component config and the kubelet component config. And so then having these binaries in the path, right, it's like a small number of things. But when you have an add-on, then that component is likely in a container image somewhere, right? And
also for Kubernetes, this is a problem.
Yeah.
So enlarging the scope of the dependencies that you have on the machine is always a problem. For instance, kubeproxy does not exist on the machine.
Yeah.
We have it in a container that even that does not exist before we start the cluster.
Yeah. And so the only thing I can think of, right, is to have like a sandboxed execution environment. Like you could use the CRI either on the machine itself, which has security implications, or you could do something more distributed, which has failure modes, right? Where you're like, okay, well, I have a Kubernetes API. I probably have a job controller, so let's put a job into the cluster and then inspect the output or something. But yeah, it's just getting...
One interesting thing is we can imagine a future, I don't think we're there yet, where OpenAPI actually has enough information to take on most of the validation checks. It's not going to do CIDRs, but it could at least do some of them. We certainly intend that most of the standard validation checks will be done via OpenAPI rather than as a webhook for CRDs, right?
So you would think that we could ship an OpenAPI schema in the add-on, unpack the add-on, and then...
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly not, it's not arbitrary code well, it's less arbitrary code execution at this time. Yeah, we have to like...
That sounds reasonable. I'm just trying to understand.
Yeah, I don't know what, we'd somehow have to fetch, as some part of the resolve process, we would have to, get an OpenAPI schema, and then we could validate against that.
And that is going to like solve component config needs for pre-flight validation and that kind of thing. But then like... Some
of them. It won't, I can't imagine a world where it ever can do like a CIDR check, for example. Like is CIDR 1 a subset of CIDR 2? Which I think happens in kubeproxy.
Well, and other things too, like Calico API types, right? Or a core file validation.
Yes, but perhaps those shouldn't be. Perhaps those should be in Kubernetes types. But yes, I feel like that's a separate debate as to whether or not there is all shall be assimilated into the Kubernetes model, or whether there exists a need for YAML and TOML and caddy file and JSON and all these other things.
I think it's a proper argument that you can make to be like, well, if you want to have a Kubernetes add-on, you need to support Kubernetes machinery. That's certainly ambitious.
Well, we're not here to be mediocre.
Yeah. Cool. Okay.
But I realize it is impractical, so I really like the like your finding about the environment variables in the core file. That is a big. I'm definitely going to use that, regardless of my long-term opinions about like. I'm like, okay, that's really good.
You don't want to sed anymore, Justin?
As cool as it is to learn that you can use different delimiters in sed, I will appreciate environment variables much more.
I
don't know if we have anything else on are we?
Yeah, I mean, we're pretty much through the agenda except for just any interesting items inside of the KubeADM brainstorming thing. There's a lot of interesting UX and use case stuff in here. I just commented on one of these use case items at the top of the table under add-on interface. Given a Kubernetes version, get the corresponding recommended version of a specific add-on. This is kind of just like a ecosystem question. It's just like, what do we think is better to support? Because like we could have a shared map of this, right? But I think it's kind of more to the installers, like what opinion of what add-on version you should be installing.
I certainly respect the right of any add-on tool to build whatever versions they want. I do think we should, as a Kubernetes project, have these are the versions that we have tested. And if someone wants to choose something different, that's great. But we should have the thing done. I know there's a Google open source project called the Cluster Bundle, which could be used. We could also just have a YAML file. The Cluster Bundle is sort of a more structured YAML file So it gives a little bit of extra information about like, this version and maybe some annotations and label selection.
Yeah, I agree that if we can put in some place this shared knowledge, then people can leverage on it if they want. And also, I can try to generalize the problem, because basically what we find out is that we need some sort of metadata around add-ons. One is the version, the version matrix, so add-on version to Kubernetes version. And the second one that can be interesting, at least for the Kubernetes point of view, is the list of images the add-on is going to install, because this will really help for providing a sort of support for air-gapped environment.
Well, I guess we could just have multiple packages for different versions with a map that you could vendor in.
Like Go packages, you mean?
Yeah. It's not really multi-language friendly.
I'd say the value of a structured format like the cluster bundle is that we could sort of have in a cluster bundle like both this is the CRDs and their versions, and the expansion of the CRD that the add-on operator will do, the manifest that it will use. And so you can, with fairly simple tooling, just like walk that set of objects, extract the objects, look at the objects, find the images, and sort of it's very like it's straightforward, relatively straightforward to do. It's helped a lot by the fact that like Kubernetes container images are only in like one of two places, right? They're in like I don't remember, but they're in like one of two places, and they're in like pretty arbitrary locations. So that seems to work pretty well, and the experiments I've done I like that approach. The core idea though is just to be able to know what an operator is going to do. And one way of doing that is to sort of dry run it. And the other way is to sort of be able to peek under the covers and say this operator is going to like expand out to this manifest. The latter way feels pretty straightforward if we're willing to accept that sort of dependency or that restriction that like cluster add-ons are declarative, which is sort of the space we're exploring now. But if you're willing to take that restriction, then it is fairly easy to sort of look at the underlying manifest if it's in the same structured format.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of interesting things that you could do with cluster bundle being like a customized base. I'm just thinking from like an extensibility like perspective, is people are going to want to modify their add-on declarations to be conformant with their pod security policy, or like have annotations or whatever and like be named differently. So we've been doing our best to explore what customized adds here, and the fact that it's already built into kubectl makes it simple to apply. Adding transport basically for cluster bundle and OCI images, I think will expand the ways that those things can be used.
I don't have nothing against customize. I have only a concern that the consumer that customize it is a design or implementation choice of the add-ons installer, and I think that somehow the consumer of the add-ons should be isolated from this decision. So when Kubernetes asks to the add-on installer, please give me the list of the images or the version supported by an add-on, Kubernetes should not be, let me say, forced to get into the detail of customize or the manifest or whatever. So we should kind of decouple the consumer of the add-on interface from the internal of the interface. I think this is a good practice. And if tomorrow, for any reason, you want to switch to customize to something else, the consumer should not be affected by this.
There's some parts of that I definitely agree with. So like for the KubeADM portion, trying to figure out like what images are there, since like manifest, since the ultimate output is structured, it makes sense that like you wouldn't need to know like what was generating the manifests. But I think from like an interest of packaging and like extension, we need to agree on something that is better than just raw manifests that people are expected to find replace strings in once things get a little too complicated, right? Like you wouldn't expect to be able to install a Nix or a Debian package, you know, using Yum. But people use Yum because like that's...
I totally agree. It's just, let me say, to find a good trade-off that from the consumer point of view, you expose, let me say, generic metadata which are not customized dependent. And internally, I'm perfectly fine with the customized model.
Yeah, I think adding metadata to
I'm totally supporting
is something we need to probably have more discussion about, because Customize doesn't really have opinions here on like an annotation section, like for the actual base. It's not really meant to be used like as a package. I imagine that's not true with things like Helm 3, considering that they're using an OCI image. There's like MIME types and like resource sections inside of an OCI image that allow you to say like, hey, and this, like, please insert this MIME type with this prefix and then this much data. And like that's a great place where you could squeeze in like I require this API version, or I require this image, or that kind of thing. But
yeah, listening to what you're both saying, like although I was imagining that KubeADM would itself expand the add-on, like, and then walk the tree. There's no reason for it to do that, right? We could easily just like have a tool that at some sort of creation, like does that expansion and writes the images, and then everyone would get it right there. And if you wanted to use a different method, if you wanted to use code generation, then that's fine as well. Sorry, object generation in code, that's fine as well. You just have to like say which image you're going to generate. I do think we should try to have a world where sort of the image is not like changing based on fields, right? Or like, you know, that it's sort of that is part of the version of the add-on itself, or the I think that makes for a more sensible world. I also think it'd be great to enable Customize to deal with whatever format we choose, so that if a user wants to do it, they can. And Jeff did add patches to our experiment. It is interesting to look at like the overlaps between Customize and the patches and all these things. And I do hope that there is a world where we all like extract out the common functionality, like, oh, we all want patches, and we there's not really a distinction between, like, Customize is like a delivery mechanism for the idea of not using sed and using like patches and things like that instead, or overlays.
Yeah, that's what I've been hoping for. That's my deepest yearning desire, is some kind of sensible, structured indirection exposed to users in a simple way, where they just put in the things they care about, and then out comes all the complexity. But yeah, and also just to clarify, like the add-on installer stuff is just about like cluster administration tools getting add-ons into the cluster. and whether those add-ons are fully declarative or whether or not they have a custom API with operator runtime is the add-ons decision, and should be based off of the add-ons needs, which I think a lot of add-ons really do need that stuff at the cluster infrastructure level. We can certainly think of things we would need it for WeaveNet migrations and stuff like that. So like, and it is nice if the operator runtimes, if we have tools that like also are able to use that same UX and maybe some shared API bits to declare what bases and patches they should be applying. What I'm learning from the customized project is that there's a lot of really interesting backflips that you can do inside of Kubernetes APIs, like deployments and pod specs and config maps and secrets that like I didn't know you could do. For one, the command array inside of a deployment, you can actually interpolate environment variables into. And you do not need a shell to do that at all. And then you can source those environment variables like from secrets and from config maps. And then Customize takes that a step further and allows you to use config map values in other interesting places like annotations. So it like encourages you to just use all of the objects instead of having like some abstract value collection of inputs, which gets a little funky. It's just a different way of thinking. And then the fact that like it has these opinions really wants to push the workload you're running into to be able to like have good patterns for configuration instead of like, I don't know, expecting the user to do all of this work up front. So things like the core file having environment variables is better, right, than having something templating it beforehand. Yeah. So ultimately, like meeting these needs for packaging and indirection, and then getting the thing into the cluster, that's what I'm like really focusing on right now. And the probably most interesting thing the things I'm hearing is that like the add-on installer, libraries, like they should be able to unpack an add-on and install it and uninstall it. Sounds like there's also other things like you need to be able to fetch a structured list of dependencies. It's the container image is the major one that I can think of there. And that should be agnostic, like from whatever's happening inside of the library, be it Customize or JSONet or Helm or whatever. And then that way tools like kubeadm don't have to know like the inner guts of it to do basic stuff. And then the only other thing that I'm kind of like wrapping my head around is in order to do more sophisticated things, which is like, this is probably not a problem that we have to solve immediately, but yeah, I mean, config validation or checking if a network resource is available, like these pre-flight things. And also like having some way to tell an add-on that it's being uninstalled. Like there's no, say you have a daemon set, right, that like mutates Linux kernel stuff. And when it gets uninstalled, it should like unmutate the kernel, right? So networking, drivers, bin format, support, firewall stuff, whatever. There's like no real good way to like communicate in a one-step manner to the daemon set that, hey, I am being removed.
And this is because, so I mean, obviously the operator You're talking about removing an add-on, not the add-on operator. The operator will see the deletion if it happens to be running at the time, but if it was down, then it would miss the delete, is the challenge, right?
I suppose so. Yeah.
It actually wouldn't. If we have a finalizer, it probably wouldn't miss it. The other one I've been thinking about though is it's not easy to apply a delete, right? So suppose I have a Git directory in the Weave style, right, or Sweeper style, and I have my node local DNS, and I remove it from the directory. Do I actually want to remove? Do I want to delete it, or do I just want to stop managing it? And
yeah, this is also cool. So kubectl has prune,
yes,
which is done via label selector. With Kustomize, it's really easy to label all of your resources with something unique. So that's also helpful. And then Kustomize also supports this experimental feature called a resource catalog, I think. So like when you actually apply something, all of the collection of those resources are committed to a config map. And it like is working with that. So, I mean, just like normal algorithm stuff, right? Yeah.
The other option I've been thinking about is whether we should have an enabled Boolean field, just because like expose, for example, also I had the node local DNS and I installed it, and then I had another like repo that tweaked it, like increased the memory, right? And then I delete it from one, but then I apply the second patch. Like if I just apply it naively, if it's not a patch, it will recreate that object, even though I actually wanted to apply only if exists type semantics. So I am wondering if we had an enabled disabled or an enabled field that you could set to true or enabled false, and presumably default would be true, then you would, we could actually, like, instead of deleting it, you would just sort of turn it off, which would be a very clear signal. And it would compose better, and you wouldn't need a finalizer. You probably still have a finalizer, but you wouldn't need a finalizer. And I don't know, I've been wondering whether that is a good approach or not, but honestly, I don't have enough insight.
It is certainly a declaration of intent where something needs to occur, I guess.
Yes, and it's an explicit one, which means that if you have other declarations of intent on that object that don't touch that particular field, it's okay.
So this would be for like an add-on operator use case where you have a custom resource that you're basically then purging.
Yeah, so on the node local DNS CRD, you'd have the enabled field. On the instance, you'd say enabled true would be the default. And when you wanted to uninstall node local DNS, you just set enabled false.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I also looking at the node local DNS add-on, it made me wonder if it's possible actually to just have them as one operator, but that's another discussion, I guess. There are certainly things that I did when I was messing with that would probably clash with that idea. Like there was a cluster DNS field that I put on the custom resource that you could swap to like toggle whether or not that core DNS instance was the cluster's canonical DNS server.
So, I mean, that's, first of all, that's why we're here, right? And then second, like, figure this out. And then, like, it just sounds like it sounds like you have recognized a similar use case, and then, like, you created a field that makes sense for this. And if we like that use case, should we promote it to a field that is universal and looks the same across all our add-ons?
Yeah. So it'd be interesting if there was like a node local DNS field.
Well, I'm more talking about like the enabled. Your cluster DNS field was a Boolean, right?
It was, yeah.
So it looks a bit like the enabled field idea.
Yeah, you could basically like have one core DNS and then toggle to the other one, right?
Oh, I see.
by flopping the fields. Yeah, so like you'd have one custom resource and another, one would be true and one false, and then you could flip to the new config or whatever.
But Justin, and a concept that we have in a couple of places for some of our operators, not all, is an idea of whether the operator is currently managing its operand, not managing its operand, or the operand should be removed, which lets us, for cluster singleton types of operators, lets us still have the operator there and able at any time to take over management of the operand if it should be there. But then the difference between unmanaged and removed is removed says, I'm going to wipe it out. It's going to be gone, versus an unmanaged state where we can still have it running, but for whatever reason, like you got to go in and hack something on the deployment of it because you got to work around it, whatever it may be. So that's how we kind of ended up in those 3 states.
And is that a spec field, or what is that? How does that manifest?
It's on the config for some of our operators.
That sounds cool. Thank you. I'll have a look at it.
So it's like a global kill switch on the reconciler.
Yeah, so it's really only designed for, like I said, like singleton type things. So we don't do that.
That there's like,
we have an operator that manages like lots of instances. We don't really do that.
Because you can also just do that at the instance level, right? Like you can do both. There's kind of similar things where with a lot of ingress controllers, like they will select their ingress objects based off of like a label selector, and like if it's not there, then they don't operate on those things. And then you can do the same thing by like configuring a different label selector on the global ingress controller, right? So you could say, hey, don't manage any ingresses anymore, by like switching the configuration globally instead of per ingress. And so having like a selector field is probably a decent thing to think about.
Jessica, was there a reason you didn't use it for multi objects, multi operands?
It's probably just that we haven't necessarily needed it yet. It came up more as a problem for our core platform operators, which almost entirely are singletons. Yeah,
that's fair. Yeah, it sounds great. Like many is the time I have wanted to raise the verbosity on something and been like, damn it, how do I bypass this thing?
How do you make it stop?
Stop, exactly.
For 2 seconds, yeah. So that's what our unmanaged is for. And like we do things like if things get set unmanaged, then that bubbles up to like our upgrade thing. So we're like, hey, something's being unmanaged right now.
Very cool.
That's certainly the like primary concern of mine when I'm building an abstraction, is like not making it so leaky that like you build a cage for yourself, which can be really pretty easy to do. Certainly like had struggles with that. Like I opened an issue and everything and like worked on the problem, but that I was struggling with the Prometheus CRD at one point because it didn't allow me to like use a new flag because they had a structured Kubernetes API for defining the Prometheus config, and then it was being expanded to flags inside of the operator, right? And I was like, where's my extra args? Like, you didn't think of everything here. The command line tool got updated. Now you got to update the API, right? But and there was no escape hatch. So I'm very skeptical of anything that's like, hey, look, we've made this thing that was previously infinitely unbounded, and we've added structure around it, and like go use it. I'm like, I don't know about that. I don't know. Yeah, we should definitely take a note on that. Thanks, Jessica.
Yeah, that sounds like a great escape hatch that might actually be really handy for a bunch of other things as well, like enabling multiple applies, for example, or yeah.
Yeah, I'm gonna link our type definition for it here.
Thank you.
We have around 5 minutes left. Fabrizio and Lee, did you need any other feedback on the document? Like if people have a second look, anything in particular people should take a look at?
I didn't have time to check the feedback from Lee, so.
Okay.
Yeah, the only thing I have to say there is just with the conversation today, as well as Fabrizio's comments and use cases, I've definitely thought of things that are probably essential additions to the installer library. So thanks.
Cool. Anything else, or shall we wrap up a bit early? That's a yes. All right. See you in 2 weeks again.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.